America, Christian Nation, we're going to talk about natural law, what that actually means, what is that. But we're going to do it in the context of homosexuality and same-sex marriage. We're going to use those issues kind of as case studies to think through this issue of natural law and how that applies to our thinking about current hot-button issues. So, you guys ever had a Honeycrisp apple? Anybody eat Honeycrisp apples? Oh yeah, oh yeah. They absolutely are the best. I still want a candied apple made out of a Honeycrisp apple. That would be awesome. Grocery store. You used to have to go to like Fresh Market or somewhere. Now they're everywhere. Now they're awesome. Got to get a Honeycrisp apple. But I bet nobody would go to the store to buy a Honeycrisp apple and accidentally come home with oranges. Because you know what an apple is. Right? So, given I'll credit Peter Craig for this line of argumentation, but I'm convinced if we can know that an apple is not an orange, then we're well on our way to understanding what natural law morality entails and being able to think well about some of these cultural issues that we're facing. So again, we're going to use homosexuality and same-sex marriage just as kind of a case study tonight. We're not going to look in detail. But hopefully it'll give you some fodder to think about at least. And I do want to point out that I'm using arguments here in a very generous sense. Most of the things that we'll look at that supporters of these behaviors say really are more bumper sticker slogans and rhetoric. There's not really a lot of argumentation involved there. So I'm using that in a very generous sense. And I am distinguishing, just for the sake of clarity, between behavior and identity. Okay, so someone may consider themselves having homosexual tendencies or something like that. Okay, that's different from homosexual behavior, acting on those tendencies, right? Because as we'll see, when we all have desires and things that we ought not act on, right? On which we ought not act. Grammar teacher would kill me for saying that. So we're talking about, in our case study, behaviors that go along with that. All right, so just wanted to make that distinguishing remark there. But we are bombarded by this kind of thinking constantly. And this is just homosexuality and same-sex marriage. It's not abortion or feminism or socialism or euthanasia or gun control or the millions of other moral hot-button issues that we encounter on a daily basis in our society. And as you can tell, this is a few years old since I put this together. I need to update the graphics, but I mean, it's just everywhere. It's gone from being this very taboo topic to you're a moron if you don't celebrate it and shout it from the rooftops, just in a very short span of time. I mean, I remember clearly when Ellen first came out and had her show. I was in high school. And we've gone from that to, oh my goodness, to that. It's been amazing to see. And what's so profound about this is the way that it's entrenched in our pop culture now, that ourselves included, we just absorb it. It doesn't require much thinking. It just is what it is, and everybody knows that. We live under a rock. And it's just imbibed in the cultural mindset that we find ourselves in. And because I have 3 little boys, 8, 5, and 2, I can imagine what it's going to be like when they're my age. It's scary. I mean, I know who wins in the end. I know all that. But as a father, it's scary. Just to see what's happened in my lifetime, what in the world is going to happen in their lifetimes? We have a lot of work to do. So if you like that, then be encouraged because you have plenty of job security. That's what we tell ourselves at the seminary all the time. Hey, can you believe this? Well, hey, we got plenty of job security. We got a lot to do. So you can, I guess, take comfort in that. But it's still, it is very, very alarming. So how have Christians responded to these types of issues and the way this is influencing the culture? So there's a broad range of responses, everything from cowardice and silence to not wanting to step on any toes and not wanting to be seen as the bad guy, to just full out embracing it. Well, you got to get with the times, man. This is how things are. If we're going to engage the culture, we just got to go with the flow. We've seen a lot of that. I think probably more in our circles, I'm not going to name names because I don't want to offend anyone, but I think we see more responses that are like just a couple of examples here. So you may hear something like, where do you get to define evil and good at all? You know where we get to define evil and good? We get to define it because the Bible defines it. Or something like this, either God's word is our authority or the ideas of our culture are our authority. It's either the Bible or all of those stupid people out there in the culture. That's where most of the church, at least the conservative church, where we probably, the circles we run in, are living with this type of mindset. Problem is, as Eric alluded to, why should anyone care what the Bible says if they don't find the Bible authoritative? I mean, we could just well quote a Muslim saying, well, you know where you define evil and good at? You define it from the Quran. And we would say, no you don't, and I don't care, because I don't think the Quran's authoritative. Or a Mormon, you know, it's either the Book of Mormon is our authority or the ideas of our culture are our authority. Same difference. Now, we think the Bible's true, but we have to make a case for that. It's either that, or we just appeal to some kind of mysticism and just say, well, you know, the Holy Spirit will do it. Word of God sharper than any two-edged sword, you know, pierces to the marrow, and it's going to do its thing. It's like magic. No, it's not. It's not what that passage means. That's why the apostles were going out. That's why Paul says he was put here for the defense of the gospel. He didn't say, well, I'm just going to quote some Old Testament to them, you know, it's sharper than any two-edged sword, it's going to do its thing. Woo, abracadabra. That's not what happens. It's not what we're called to. We're called to actually work. Living with Teenagers magazine from Lifeway, this is an older quote, but still holds true. It says, unfortunately, Christianity is often equated with bigotry, racism, homophobia, and sexism. Today's generation wants nothing to do with that brand of faith. So you quote your Bible verse, and it's heard in the context of this. Well, yeah, of course you think that, you bigoted Christian. Your hate book tells you to think that way. That's how the culture is hearing it. Now, obviously, we think that's incorrect. That's what much of the culture is hearing. So this is one reason I'm so passionate about this, because I think this is one of the main reasons, you know, you guys heard the stats, teenagers walking away from the faith and all that. I think this has a really big part in that because of the way Christianity is being perceived. So just quoting Bible verses, talking about God's plan for marriage and those sorts of things, while true, oftentimes have very little impact in the secularized culture that we're trying to engage. So there are a lot of resources that we can talk about that answer the objections from so-called gay Christians or folks trying to argue that the Bible actually affirms homosexual behavior. There are those people out there. That's not what we're talking about tonight, okay? I really like this whole idea of natural law because we can look at what the Bible says and then say, but why does God say that? Is he just a cosmic killjoy? He has some sadistic interest in our sex lives or moral lives or whatever? Or is there an actual reason that he says that? Other than saying, well, you know, he's good. Well, what does that mean? Now you just moved the goalpost back. Now we got to talk about what good means, which we're going to do tonight, to properly understand what even that sentence means in the context of God and willing something for our lives. So the real issue in all of this is a metaphysical issue. That's just a big word that means studying reality. What does it mean to be? What does it mean to be a human? Is there a human nature? What does that mean? What does that look like? What does that entail? These are metaphysical issues. It means not physical, right? Not the metaphysics section in your bookstore, all right, your local Barnes & Noble. That's New Age witchcraft stuff. They just hijacked the term. This is a philosophical term studying reality as such. What does it mean to be? Okay, that's where the real issue lies. So as Eric said, we all do philosophy to some extent every day. If you're talking about God, then you're doing theology to some extent whenever you're talking about God. So it's not whether or not we should or do these things, it's whether we're doing them well or whether we're doing them poorly. And so we want to do them well. Eric actually shared this quote with me just the other day from a comedian, kind of political commentator, who was obviously an unbeliever, Greg Gutfeld. He says, "I totally respect religious folks, and it's your club, so you have a right to tell members how to live, but you can't use your doctrine to tell me how to live. It can only influence how you live. If you want to argue that my promiscuity, drug use, and cross-dressing are wrong, go for it. But don't use the Bible to do it. Not only will I not listen, but I don't have to listen. You can make coherent moral arguments against my sordid life without religion as your tool. It's more of a challenge, and it's one you should embrace." Now, obviously, we could argue from the Bible to an unbeliever who we've actually made a case that the Bible is true and that God exists and all of these sorts of things. But even then, we're back to, but why does God say that? It still just seems very surface level to say. I mean, it's like me telling my kid, "But Daddy, why?" "Because I said so. Just be quiet and do it." That's the answer some nights, right? When you're tired and you don't care. But you want to give a better answer because you want them to understand why you're asking them to do these things so that they grow up to be the kind of persons you want them to be. So just saying, well, because God says so. Okay, I understand He's our creator and authority, and maybe I don't understand the reason He says everything, but there are certain things that I can understand the reason for. So let's take time to dig into those and have a deeper understanding of these things, which only deepens my love and worship and appreciation for who God is and how He wills my good and everyone else's. So what we want to do tonight is just look at 2 steps that I think will help us navigate these muddy waters. So we're going to try to understand what we mean by classical natural law arguments for morality. What in the world does that mean? And then again, as a case study, we're going to try to apply some of this natural law theory to some of the arguments and rhetoric for homosexuality, same-sex marriage, and all that we hear about. And then we'll chase a couple of rabbits, hopefully, at the end. All right, so you guys ready to jump in? All right, so what in the world is classical natural law arguments for morality? Well, classically understood, nature means what something is. Okay, so we're not talking about the mountains and the moon and the stars and the trees and all that. We're not talking about physical nature out there like PBS, right? Philosophically, a nature refers to something's essence, to what something is. It's its definition, so to speak, okay? So that's what we're getting at. So natural law is based on what something is. What is the good of that thing based on what it is? It really comes a lot from the thinking of Aristotle, really perfected, at least to an extent, by Thomas Aquinas in the 1200s, and it's been argued for and debated and built upon throughout the centuries. But what's beautiful about it is just grounded in the reality we all share in common. We don't have to appeal to an authority. We don't have to ask someone to accept our authority in the Bible or just blindly believe it or whatever if they don't have any reason to believe it's true for whatever particular person we're talking about. So it gives us common ground in the public arena. It doesn't mean this is easy. I'm not saying these conversations, well, yeah, just use this argument, boom, everybody's going to be on your side. Now, I'm not saying that. There's still a lot of work to be done and a lot of argumentation to be done. But it gives us common ground in the public arena from which we can build a case. And as we'll see, hopefully at the end, it leads to the truthfulness of the existence of God, which then could be built on to the truthfulness of Christianity as a whole. So remind me if I forget for some reason, and we'll visit that at the end. So, nature, what something is, all right? So before we can really dive into natural law arguments and natural law theory, we need to define another term. And that is the term good. So I may say, yeah, we had a pretty good day at work today. Yeah, I got 3 really good boys at home. Man, that pizza we had for lunch yesterday was really good. The Tar Heels had a pretty good season this year. They're all using the word good, but hopefully not all meaning exactly the same thing. Because hopefully I don't mean my boys are good in the exact same way that I mean pizza is good. right? Because I don't eat my boys. But there's something about good that is being picked out about both of those things. And so good is actually being used in an analogous way, meaning something kind of the same, but kind of different. So what exactly do we mean by good, or what should we mean? Well, again, classically understood, good is that which fulfills the end or the purpose of something according to its nature, according to what it is. Okay, so if I ask you, does your an ear that doesn't see well, is that a good ear or a bad ear?
Good ear.
How do you know?
It's not supposed to see. It's not its nature.
What does it do?
Ears.
But how do you know that it hears well? I just said it didn't see. So an ear that doesn't see well, does that tell you anything about the ear? No, right? Because it's not the kind of thing that sees. It's the kind of thing that hears. So whether it hears well or not will determine whether or not it's a good ear. Does it fulfill the end or purpose towards which it's directed? So a thing is good insofar as it is in being. And what I mean by that is it exists as the kind of thing it should according to its nature. So when you use the example of an ear or of an eye, and an eye that doesn't see well, we would say is a bad eye to whatever extent, right? So I have glasses on because I have an astigmatism that I should wear my glasses much more than I do, and decided to put them on tonight because my eyes were going like this, right? So you needed some help there. So my eyes aren't as good as they should be because they're not totally fulfilling the purpose towards which they're directed. So pretty straightforward stuff, I think. That's kind of commonsensical, even though we may not think about using good in those terms. But notice what's going on here. In order to know the good for something, what do we have to know? Well, we have to know its nature, right? We have to know what that thing is. So if I said, being submerged all the time in salt water is a really good thing. For a shark, but not for a human, right? Because you would be dead. Because you're not that kind of thing, right? So we only know the good of things if we know what those things are that we're talking about. Does that make sense? You with me? All right, cool. Now, what's really cool about this is completely objective. It doesn't matter how much I want to be able to breathe underwater without scuba gear. I'm not that kind of thing. And I can't pretend that I am and go try to live in the ocean because I will die, right? I don't change reality based on my preferences. It doesn't matter how much I want my ears to see. They're not that kind of thing. We discover these things about reality. We do not invent them or put our preference on them. We discover them and either accept it or live with the consequences. And our culture is trying to put their desires upon reality, and they're eventually going to live with the consequences because it's not going to end well, either here or beyond. So it's not a matter of subjective preference, not a matter of feelings, and really has no bearing on why I am seeing well or not. If somebody is born blind, and when they're just born that way, that's who they are, it doesn't make their eyes good, right? Because their eyes are not fulfilling their purpose. They have defective eyes. It doesn't make it a good thing. All right, so how does this tie into moral goodness? Well, we're getting there. So let's go back to the apple for just a minute. Let's go back to the apple for just a minute. This isn't a Honeycrisp apple, so don't look for green apples if you go to the grocery store.
I didn't think so.
They're like red and yellow kind of mixture.
I don't like the green.
They're really good. Yeah, I'm not crazy about the green ones either, but the picture was cool. So when we try to make our arguments, again, I said I'm convinced if we can know what an apple is, and that an apple is not an orange, then we're well on our way to making our case for natural law. Okay, so we want our starting points. What's up, man? Congratulations.
Thank you.
Did you drive yourself here?
Yeah, yes.
That's scary. Let me leave first before you leave. Okay? Where's my pizza? What's up with this? All right, so we want our beginning point for our argument to be as uncontroversial as possible. And as we'll see, even our uncontroversial starting point really is one of the most controversial things that we're going to talk about tonight. And our starting point is, we know what an apple is. We know that when we go to the grocery store to buy apples, unless we're blind or have defective eyes or something, some other sense that's defective, we don't accidentally come home with oranges or bananas or something like that, because we know what apples are. And in fact, we know what apples really are. It doesn't mean that we have exhaustive knowledge of apples, but it does mean that when we know something about an apple, we know something true about that apple, even though we don't have completely exhaustive knowledge of everything about this apple.
My son has a privation in his tooth right now.
Oh no.
You guys, I just got a text, Tim cracked his tooth, tried, so
Yikes.
I might be back, I might not.
Well, good, we can stay till 9 o'clock.
That's right, I'll lock the door.
All right, and so this is something we don't have to argue for. This is evident to us. All right, this is what sense perception is. It is evident to us. There's nothing more basic to say that this is an apple that I have to appeal to. If the apple doesn't convince you that it's an apple, then no argument is going to convince you of that. Actually, giving you an argument would move you one step away from the apple, because then you have to accept my argument in order to get back to the apple. So we're actually moving away from what we're trying to prove. So sense experience. And when people say, well, how do you know you're not living in a dream? How do you know you're not in the matrix? And blah, 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 blah. Well, because I'm not. It's evident to me. Could I be wrong? Yeah, it's logically possible. But I have zero reason to think that I am. How do I know I'm not dreaming right now? Because I woke up this morning. I knew I was dreaming after I woke up, because now I'm awake. And all of this is evident to my senses. And then I form judgments about all these things and all this cool epistemology stuff that we're not going into tonight. All right? So this seems really simplistic. Like, what's the big deal? Yeah, obvious, common sense. But this is probably the most controversial thing we'll talk about. Because the modern prevalent philosophy today, this is your $5 word for the night, second one of the metaphysics, it's called nominalism. And it's this idea that things don't actually have natures. Like, there are no things that are apples. There are individual things that are similar in some way, and just for convenience sake, we call all those things apples. There is no human nature that we all share in common. They're just these individual things that have some similarities, and just for the sake of convenience, we call them all humans. It's called nominalism. It rejects this idea of things having universal natures. All right, so we're arguing that we have a universal human nature that we all share in common. Apples all share the nature of an apple in common, right? But nominalism would reject all that. And it's completely self-defeating, because then you say, well, how do you know that all those things are similar? Well, you know, like those trees out there, they're not really trees. We just group them all together because they all have those things called leaves. How do you know what a leaf is? Well, you know, it's all those things that have veins and they're kind of green. Well, how do you know what a vein is? How do you know what green is? How do you even know what nominalism is? Because we're all sharing this thought right now about nominalism. It has now become a universal in our intellects that we're all sharing in common, because we're all thinking about it right now to some level. But nominalism would say, no, that's not possible. But you just did it. It really just completely breaks down into a self-defeating. That's very simplistic, so it's deeper than that. But really, I think, ends up breaking down into a self-defeating claim. But all of this kind of philosophizing badly about these things that should be evident to us remind me of a story I heard Ravi Zacharias tell about Sherlock Holmes and Watson. They went on a camping trip one night, and Sherlock wakes up and he nudges Watson. He says, Watson, look up. What do you see? And Watson says, well, I see stars and stars and more stars. And Sherlock said, yes, Watson, and what does that tell you? And this part I always have to read because I get it wrong. And Watson says, well, it tells me we have millions of planets and millions of galaxies and potentially billions of planets. It tells me astrologically that Saturn is in Leo. It tells me horologically that it's about 2:45. It tells me theologically that this is a vast universe and we're just a tiny speck on it. And it tells me meteorologically that tomorrow is going to be a nice day. Why? What does it tell you, Holmes? And Sherlock said, Watson, you idiot! Our tent has been stolen. And all of his philosophizing, he missed the obvious. That we know what an apple is. And if we know what an apple is, then surely we know what a human is. Because, to use vernacular from where I'm from, we is one. Right? Grew up in Chatham County. You guys know where that is, right in the middle of the state. It's our city where Aunt Dee lived her last days after the Andy Griffith Show, so our claim to fame. But we know what people are because we are people. We have inside information on that, right? And because we know what humans are, we can know what makes for a good human. Just like when you go to the grocery store, you know what an apple is, and you kind of pick around and look, and you see, this one's got a bruise, and this one's got a worm in it, and this one's got some kind of funky rot or something. You don't get those apples because that's not what an apple is supposed to be. That's not a good apple. I bought a whole bag. Sometimes you get Honeycrisp apples that are like bigger than softballs. They're huge. You can get small ones too. Bought a whole bag, I think from Walmart one time, Honeycrisp. They're not cheap. Sunday morning, I think, you're ready for church. Like, oh man, I got those Honeycrisp apples. I'm gonna slice one of those, have some peanut butter. It's beautiful on the outside. I sliced every one of those things open. Rotten to the core. Every single one of them. I was bummed, man. I was so mad. But guess what? I knew. Don't eat that. Because that's not what an apple is supposed to be. It's not a good apple. So if we know what apples are, we can know what good apples are. If we know what humans are, we can know what constitutes the good for human beings. Now remember, the good is that which fulfills the end or purpose of something according to its nature, according to what it is. So we can think back to our eye or our ear example and the purposes towards which they're directed. And we have various faculties that are just easy to point to demonstrate that. So eyes are for seeing, ears for hearing, heart for pumping blood, lungs for taking in oxygen, etc., etc. So we can know, for example, that since our lungs are meant for taking in oxygen, sniffing paint thinner all day is not a good thing. Objectively, it doesn't matter how much the person sniffing it wants to do that, or what benefit they think they're getting from that. It is contrary to the purpose of their lungs, and necessarily, it is a bad thing, right? Now, that doesn't mean that just because our lungs are meant for taking in oxygen, that it's bad to blow up a balloon, for example. Because that question comes up sometimes. Well, then, what about this purpose and this purpose? Well, we can use our lungs to blow up a balloon. That's fine. Because it's not contrary to the purpose of our lungs. It doesn't harm us in that way, right? Sniffing paint thinner is bad for you on a number of levels. All right. Now, if we blow up balloons all day long to the point that we can no longer breathe, then that would become a bad thing, right? But just because we blow up a balloon and use our faculty for something other than its purpose, that's one thing. Using our faculties for something contrary to their purposes, that's where objective badness comes in. Does that distinction make sense?
That's not a good thing.
Now, here's where I think it gets cool. And Francis Beckwith pointed this out. It was the first time I had heard it. You guys know who Richard Dawkins is, right? Famous atheist author and speaker and all that. So just to show you that no one can actually live this out consistently, because you can only fight reality so far until reality eventually fights back, right? Remember, we discover these things about reality. We don't invent them. So Richard Dawkins says this in his book, River Out of Eden. It's a pretty famous quote. He says, in a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, just electrons and selfish genes, some people are going to get hurt, other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares, DNA just is, and we dance to its music. Now notice, he's saying there is no purpose, there is no end towards which things are directed. So by implication, there can be no good or no evil. if that is in fact how the universe works, if there aren't these ends towards which we're directed. But in his famous book, The God Delusion, he talks about a man named Kurt Wise. Kurt Wise was a Harvard-trained geologist, studied under Stephen Jay Gould, the famous paleontologist. Kurt Wise was also a young Earth creationist. I guess he still is a young Earth creationist. He didn't think he could have a career in academia holding his positions, so he left, and I think he chairs the science department at one of the Southern Baptist seminaries, actually. I forget where. But Dawkins says this about Kurt Wise in The God Delusion. He says, "I'm hostile to fundamentalist religion because it subverts science and saps the intellect. The Kurt Wise story is just plain pathetic and contemptible. The wound to his career and his life's happiness was self-inflicted, so unnecessary, so easy to escape. I am hostile to religion because of what it did to Kurt Wise, and if it did that to a Harvard-educated geologist, just think what it can do to others less gifted and less well-armed." So he reveals his true colors and the fact that, just like the rest of us, he lives in reality. And he can't escape that reality no matter how hard he tries. Because notice what he says. If you know anything about Richard Dawkins, he thinks empirical science is the only means of knowing truth. Okay? So he says fundamentalist religion subverts science. So it prevents us from knowing truth, which saps the intellect. What? You mean my intellect is meant to know truth? But you just told me there is no purpose towards which we're directed. We're just dancing to the music of our DNA. You can't have it both ways. And furthermore, why write books that you want people to read if you don't think you're communicating truth that they need to know? He's just dancing to the music of his DNA to write his next book. No, he's not. He's writing what he's convinced is true, and he wants to communicate that to others because he knows they have intellects that are pursuing truth, and he wants to share that with them and make a little money in the process, but that's beside the point. Now look at what else he says. He says that to zap the intellect is pathetic, not just pathetic, it's also contemptible, and it affects our life's happiness because he's not using his intellect to its full potential to know the truth and to share that with others, at least what Dawkins is convinced is true. But again, you just told me, Dawkins, there is no purpose, therefore there can be no good or evil, and you can't say that what happened to Kurt Wise is bad in any way, shape, or form. It just is. Neutral. It just happened. Do you see what he's doing there? He's trying to have his cake and eat it too, which is a stupid expression, but whatever. You guys know what it means. Because who wants to bake a cake and not eat it? That makes no sense. But that's what he's doing. He wants to get rid of any possibility of using anything in reality to argue for God, but still hold on to these things that as a human being, he cannot let go of because he lives in reality. That's why natural law gives us this common ground, because you can fight it and fight it and fight it, but somewhere in your thinking it's going to pop its little head up because you can't escape it completely, no matter how crazy somebody may be. So finally, let's bring this around to moral goodness. We talked about what good means, but what about moral goodness? Alrighty, so we all pursue what we take to be good for us. We may be wrong about that, but nobody pursues something simply because they know it's bad for them. Now let me qualify that so you don't misunderstand me. I obviously eat too much pizza and too much chocolate and too much ice cream and all of those sorts of things, even though I know that I shouldn't. But the taste, the pleasure, whatever it is a good that I perceive, and that is what I pursue. I don't pursue, oh, I just want to be a little more overweight. No, I want to pursue that chocolate because it tastes so good, right? So we all pursue what we take to be good for us, even though we may be wrong. Reason tells us what is actually good for us. Again, because we know what humans are, we know what the good for a human being is. Again, just think about our eye or ears or whatever. So the rational person, and we could say the moral person, will pursue what is actually good for them, even if it's opposed to their feelings. So being moral in a natural law sense could essentially be called just being a rational human being and pursuing what is actually good. Okay, so let me give you an example of this. Well, first let me ask the question, why should we be rational and thus moral? Well, because like our other faculties, as we've said, our intellects are directed towards pursuing and knowing truth, and our wills are directed towards attaining the good. That's just how we find ourselves as human beings. We don't make that up about ourselves. We just work to either do that well or we don't do that so well. But our intellects are always directed towards pursuing truth. Our wills are always directed towards attaining the good. So if our intellects tell us what the good is, then our will should follow our intellect. But what have we done in the culture and in the church? Our intellects follow our will. We want this to be the case. So now let me try to figure out how to rationalize it and attain it. Rather than saying, this is what I discover about reality. This is the good. Now, let's attain that. Now, none of us do that perfectly. I'm not saying, well, if you're like me, then your will should always follow your intellect, because I do that perfectly every moment of every day. Obviously not. But that is how we should live. We don't live that way, which is why we need a Savior. Because pursuing something in the wrong way, that's just what we call sin. And we all do that multiple times a day, many more times than we should, at least in my case. So let me give you an example of kind of how this works out. So think about an alcoholic. For the sake of example, let's say his alcoholism is completely 100% genetic. Now, whether there's a genetic link to alcoholism, looks like the evidence says there is some link, whatever. But let's say it is completely 100%. He can't help it. He was born with it. 100% genetic. He has no family. He has no friends. He has a trust fund. So he can stay in his house all day long, drink himself silly, never get in a car, never disappoint anyone because he doesn't show up to a birthday party or whatever, and just pursue what he takes to be good for him, which is consuming large amounts of alcohol and getting sloppy drunk every moment of every day. Is that good for him? He's born that way. He wants to do it. He's not hurting anyone. Is it good? Why? I see a lot of this, which is the right answer, but why?
Not healthy.
He's harming himself, right?
He wasn't made though. He wasn't made to do that.
Exactly. He is acting contrary to multiple purposes towards which he's directed, both physiologically, biologically, socially. We are social creatures as human beings. Rationally, he's preventing his rational faculties from functioning properly. In no sense of the term good could we say that this is good. And it doesn't matter if he was born that way or not. Any more, like I said, than being born blind means you have good eyes because you're born that way. No, it means you have defective eyes. And you need help. This would simply mean that, golly, this poor guy, I already felt sorry for him, but I should have that much more compassion for him because he truly can't help it. He needs extra help to overcome this defectiveness of his genes or whatever the case is. But it doesn't do anything to us determining whether it's good or not. Do you see how that works? Because that's exactly the same kind of argument that's going to be used for homosexual behavior, for same-sex marriage, and those sorts of things. But it doesn't make it good, as we'll see. So hopefully a lot of this sounds at least somewhat familiar, because I think it's exactly what Paul is talking about in Romans 2 when he talks about the law written on the heart. Now, it doesn't really matter whether any of this is innate in us. I don't think it is in the sense that most people use that term, but it is based a lot on our common sense interactions with reality and figuring out what is good or bad for different things. But I do think it is what Paul was referring to in Romans 2 with the law written on the heart. But it is also what our founding fathers referred to in multiple places, but this is particularly from the Declaration of Independence. When in the course of human events, I should memorize this, I suppose, but I'm a bad history student. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with one another and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. And then in our Constitution, we see that we are pursuing life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. We're all created equal, endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. But you know what they never do? As far as I know, Eric can correct me if I'm wrong, but they never quote a Bible verse. They appeal to human nature. Now, most people back then were theists. They at least believed that God existed, so they had an easier time referring to nature's God. But even then, they didn't quote Scripture. They referred to the common knowledge that we have as human beings about what is good and bad for human beings based on our natures. Martin Luther King referred to this in a letter from a Birmingham jail. He says, I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. To put it in the terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal and natural law. So we'll get into this. I think we'll chase a rabbit hopefully at the end. But human law is simply an outworking in specific instances of the natural law. So we determine the generalities of what is good and bad for human beings, like you shouldn't kill innocent people. And then we pass human laws to say, yeah, that's considered first-degree murder, that's considered second-degree murder, that's considered manslaughter, those sorts of things. We figure, hey, we should probably respect each other because we all have the right not to be inhibited from fulfilling our goods as human beings. So that means we should probably have property rights because private property flows from natural law. We should probably have speed limits because if we let people drive like knuckleheads, then they're probably going to infringe on other people's rights. So we need to actually make roadways and traffic laws and those sorts of things. So the human law is specific outworkings that flow from natural law. Okay, so don't let those different things confuse you there. Alrighty, so let's apply this to our case study of homosexuality. So what is the good of sex? Well, just like our other faculties, our sexual faculties have certain ends towards which they're directed. So obviously there is a biological purpose, which is procreation. Big surprise there, right? We all know this. We studied biology in 5th grade or 6th grade or whatever it was. So it should be obvious, should be uncontroversial. So it's not dependent, again, on our intentions. We discover these things. And sex would not exist if not for procreation. Asexual reproduction exists in nature, so we know that's possible. But sexual reproduction is at least partially geared explicitly towards procreation. Maybe we'd still form emotional bonds or whatever, but our sexual faculties would not be geared towards procreation if that was not the purpose here. All right? And children that naturally result from these sexual unions of a man and a woman need the long-term care of that mother and that father. Men or women are different. I know you guys didn't know that, right? Shocker of the night. Men and women are different. Just ask my boys. Because they always want mommy, 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 mommy. Because I'm usually the bad guy, right? And the interesting thing about the biological purpose here, so I never really thought about it until I was studying this stuff and read somebody who said it. We only have half of the biological components needed for sexual reproduction. Our sexual, our sex organs and those sorts of things, it's only half the system. They have to be conjoined with the other half of the system to form a complete reproductive system. That's why we are naturally geared towards the opposite sex, because it fulfills us physically, but it also fulfills us emotionally. Because once again, men and women are different. Now, the term, the phrase "opposites attract," that didn't just happen, because men and women are opposite in many different ways. And that is the natural attraction. Even though that may not be the attraction that some individual person happens to have, for whatever reason, it doesn't change the fact that that is the natural direction of human beings, to be attracted to the opposite sex. So we're directed towards another soul, essentially for completeness. So C.S. Lewis talks about two aspects of this emotional purpose in his book, The Four Loves, which I have not read, but I read these quotes, so they work. So he says that sex itself is the object of what he calls Venus, so just the act itself. But the beloved is the object of what he calls Eros, this kind of other aspect of love, and just using that in a general sense. So essentially, Eros is the perfection of Venus that provides the stability for a home in which a mother and father care for the children that naturally result from their sexual unions. Now, obviously, this raises questions of contraception and all this sort of stuff. Not having that discussion tonight. That's a whole nother topic, and we can talk about that at some other time, but not our purpose for tonight. Okay, but obviously this is completely contrary to our hookup culture. So Jay Budichevsky says this hookup culture that well, you just go have sex with whoever you want to and just move on, whatever, just what's tonight, no big deal. He says it's like taking a piece of masking tape and sticking it and resticking it, sticking it and resticking it, sticking it and resticking it, and you think it's going to keep on sticking. Doesn't work that way. You guys know this is an intensely emotional thing. Not to mention the physical dangers and all those things, but just from an emotional standpoint. You can't toy with things like that and not expect there to be repercussions. Again, you can only fight reality so far before reality eventually catches up with you. Alrighty, so the procreative purpose of sex is directly infused with the emotional purpose of sex. So Ed Feser, who as a philosopher I really like, kind of puts it all together here. He says, what is good for human beings in the use of sexual capacities is to use them only in a way consistent with this dual purpose. This is a necessary truth, for the good for us is defined by our nature and the purposes of its various elements. It cannot possibly be good for us to use them in any other way, whether an individual person thinks it is or not, any more than it can possibly be good for an alcoholic to indulge his taste for excessive drink. So by implication, homosexual behavior and tangentially same-sex marriage cannot possibly be good things, because they're contrary to this natural purpose of our sexual faculties and what the marriage union even is. Again, they're man's attempt to seek something good, the union and all of these things, but in the wrong way. And again, that's just what we call sin. And we all fall into that sin camp one way or another. Alrighty? So, I'm going to skip over some of this because we already talked about that. So all of this, all of the debate, all of the angst in our culture currently, but yet we know what an apple is. And only a hyper-skeptic who can't even really maintain their own skepticism would question our knowledge of that. And if we know what an apple is, then we can know what we are and what constitutes the good for us. And in this case, what constitutes the good of our sexual faculties. All right, so I'll give you a few examples of how this plays out, but any questions at the moment? I'll pause for a minute. Clear as mud or molasses. All right, seeing none, I move we adjourn. Kidding. All right, so let's just go through just a couple of, well, we do more than a couple, but just a few of kind of the rhetoric, bumper sticker slogans and things that we hear a lot. And see how we can be comfortable and okay not immediately saying, well, you know what Paul says in 1 Corinthians, don't you? I mean, the Bible says we can go there, but that doesn't have to be our first play. And even if you're more comfortable with that being your first play, it doesn't have to be your only play. I hope you have a much deeper knowledge and appreciation now for why God says the things he does. Because he loves us. And to love someone is to will their good. Now we know what the good is, regarding sexual faculties and stuff at least. That's why God says what he does about those things. Not just because, let's make this law up. No, he created us with our natures. We'll talk about that at the end. So he knows what the good for us is because he determined that. And he wills our good. That's why he commands the things that he does. But with this knowledge, I think that gives you a deeper appreciation for what we even mean by saying that he wills our good. And well, you know, maybe Allah wills our good. And he says something opposite. Well, no, that's just a misunderstanding of what good is. We have to actually know what good means for, well, you know, God's good. God's good all the time, right? For that to even make sense. And to say God is good means something far deeper than to say what is good for us. Remember when I said, my boys are good, pizza's good, this is good, that's good. We used it in an analogous way. We do that with God as well. To say we're good human beings means we're living in a way that fulfills the purpose of human beings. But to say God is good doesn't mean that, well, you know, he's a good old boy. He's living just the way God should live. No. He is goodness itself. He's not a good thing. He doesn't have any ends towards which he's directed. He's not trying to fulfill some purpose. He is pure fulfillment, if you want to put it that way. He's pure act, pure existence. So if good is a matter of existence, he is existence itself, then he's not just a good thing. He's goodness itself. So it's thinking about good in our terms and removing all the limits. Mind-blowing when you start trying to comprehend just a little bit of who God is. But I think really at least moves us beyond the superficial notion of God's good all the time, and all the time God is good as long as he gives me what I want. All right? Because that's what we mean. Well, God really blessed me today. Whoo, God's good. Well, what about when you just had a tooth crack and now your tooth's dead and you got to go to the dentist tomorrow? Is he still good? Yes, because he's not good like us. He's goodness itself. Gives a whole different spin on the problem of evil and those sorts of things when you start understanding what it means for God to be good. Side topic, sorry. We'll move on.
We
All right.
covered that with the doctrine of God, so.
That's right. Well, I knew you had talked about it, so it wasn't completely foreign here.
See how this all wraps together.
That's right. That's right. So a word of caution, again for Phaser, before we jump into some of this stuff. He says, and if seeking what is bad for us has a tendency, again, people seeking what they think is good for them, but it's actually bad for them. So implicitly, they're seeking what is bad for them. So if seeking what is bad for us has a tendency to impair one's capacity to perceive what is true and good, especially where sex is concerned, when it follows Then it follows that widespread rejection of traditional sexual morality is bound to have as much to do with the sort of cognitive corruption that Aquinas calls blindness of mind as it does with the making of honest intellectual mistakes. That people who don't behave in accordance with traditional sexual moral norms also don't believe that these norms have any solid intellectual foundation is thus in no way surprising. So we are fighting an uphill battle. Now, we know who wins in the end. I get all that. God's good and He's big and all that. I understand that. But when we're having conversations with people on the street, we're fighting an uphill battle. Because even a lot of times they're making intellectual mistakes. And what we're able to do is clear away those intellectual mistakes so they can't hide behind those. So we remove those obstacles. But when people think badly for long enough, eventually that has an effect and can prevent them from thinking well at all. Just watch political debates. Right? I mean, that is where we are largely as a culture. The complete moral... See, I started to show this little cartoon and I didn't, but it's easy for us to step back and think, man, people have no morals anymore, right? It's just all relativism and whatever. No, people think they have morals. There is more moral outrage now than I have seen in my lifetime, I think. The problem it is completely out of ignorance. They cannot think their way out of a wet paper bag. But neither can most Christians. We don't have much to offer in the intellectual components of culture as a church far too often. It goes back to, what's his name, Greg, or whatever his name is, the quote we read earlier. Yeah, this is harder to do than just to quote your pious-sounding Bible verses. But this is what we've got to do. So maybe I don't know if we've lost a generation or not. It's not for me to decide or to know. But by golly, I can start working on the next. But if we don't make a change, they're going to come up just as bad or worse. Right? So somewhere along the line, something, if it can change for the bad, there's always a remnant. With enough hard work, it can change back for the good too, right? But there is this thing we have to at least be aware of, this cognitive dissonance that has just blinded certain people because they've thought so poorly for so long that there's so much gunk to get through for them to even have a rational thought that argumentation isn't necessarily going to help that person possibly. But you can remove those obstacles. People ask sometimes why I debate on Facebook or things, and I don't nearly as much as I used to. I used to spend way too much time doing that. But a lot of times it's, number one, because I'm prideful and I want to win the argument, but sadly, in a nice way. But I know other people are reading it because they tell me they are. At church, oh, I saw that conversation you were having with that guy the other day. Man, thank you for doing that. Other people read these things. So whether it affects that one person or not, I have no control over that. But I can at least tear away those intellectual obstacles they're bringing up, and hopefully somebody else will be helped in the process. So don't ever think that it's just a lost cause and we shouldn't waste our time doing any of this. All right, so just a few of these slogans that we hear. You're just an intolerant, homophobic, hate-filled bigot. This little graphic says, funny, this chicken tasted better before I knew it was basted in hate and homophobia. A little Chick-fil-A graphic there, if you remember that whole controversy. So the problem is here, as Frank Turk says, we only tolerate things with which we disagree. If I already agree with your position, then I'm not tolerating you. I'm on your side. We only tolerate things with which we disagree. All people are created equal because we have a shared human nature, but all ideas are not. So homophobia, bullying, those sorts of things, yes, that's always wrong. We should never do those things. But that doesn't mean the ideas or the behavior, by implication, are good. That doesn't follow at all. That's completely irrational. And if I must agree with someone in order to tolerate them, but this person disagrees with me, then why is it okay for them to be intolerant of me by their own definition of what tolerance means. This is a complete double standard. Disagreement does not equal fear or hatred. Just ask my sons, because I disagree with them a lot, but I disagree with them because I love them, or maybe because I had a lack of sleep, but usually because I love them. If I didn't love them, then I wouldn't care how they acted, and they could do whatever. But it's because I love them that I disagree with their behavior, and I want to correct that in love, right? So just because I disagree with someone doesn't mean I hate them. And we're offering reasonable arguments for our views. That's the exact opposite of what it means to be a bigot. Bigotry is this irrational position against some person or group of people for some irrational reason. We're making arguments. If we're wrong, okay, fine, but show me where I'm wrong in my argumentation. Don't just call me names. That's just an ad hominem in logic. You're just calling someone an insult and thinking that defeats the argument. It doesn't work that way. Alrighty? So we mentioned this one already. I was born that way, so it's natural for me to be an alcoholic, is what we talked about. Same argument here. It was natural for me to be a homosexual. Again, nature refers to what something is. So we're not talking about birds and bees and flowers and trees and all that. We're talking about human nature. And good is determined by our nature. So completely genetic desire does not necessarily entail the good of that desire. Just like in our alcoholic example, we can carry that over to this homosexual tendency or whatever. I don't think there is necessarily a genetic component there. They try to argue that there is, but whether there is or not is completely irrelevant from a natural law standpoint regarding argumentation. And why is genetic desire unchangeable, but somehow gender is changeable? So I have this biology that tells me I'm one thing, but I feel like I should be something else. So I can ignore the biology and go with my feelings, but I can't ignore my feelings and go with the biology. That's completely arbitrary. You got to make a case for why that should be. And most of the time, it's probably going to be because they have a bad philosophical view of what it means to be a human being. Either they reject human nature in general, like nominalism does, and I can be whatever I want to be, I just define reality for myself, as Justice Kennedy said, or they hold what most people hold, to a dualistic view of human nature. You guys watch Freaky Friday or 13 going on 30 or some of these Disney kind of movies where people swap bodies? You know, their soul gets trapped in another body and all this. That's all based on a Cartesian view of human nature, that we are a ghost in a machine, that we're a soul operating this meat machine, and one day, you know, we're going to be free from these chains of this body. No. That they would try to argue that, yeah, see, I have a male machine, but I have a female soul, and I just got put in the wrong machine, so to speak. No, that's not what a human being is. That's a wrong view of humanity. A human is, there is a duality there, but it is a duality in unity. So a human is a body-soul composite that makes a human being. The soul is what makes the human what it is, and the matter, loosely speaking, is what differentiates us from other human beings. So we all share a human nature, but we're not all the same human person, right? We're different people. So we have a body-soul unity. That's why we await the resurrection. Because when we're dead, we're absent from the body, present with the Lord, but we're only half a person. We're not a complete person. Which also, yeah, all this stuff ties together, like Eric said. Then we hear all of these, I went to heaven and came back, and I went to hell and came back, and I walked around on the streets of gold with Jesus. No, you didn't. You didn't have legs. Because you're just an disembodied soul awaiting the resurrection to have a body again, to be a complete person again. So you didn't walk around on anything because you didn't have legs. unless you had spiritual legs, whatever that would even be. So all of these things start tying together with each other when you're thinking well through these categories. Alrighty, so let's move on to a few others, and I've already mentioned this. We all have desires on which we ought not act. Whether we're born with them, whether we acquire them, whatever the case may be. Just because I have the desire doesn't mean I should act on it. How do I know which desires I ought to act on? Which ones are actually good, according to whatever the thing is that I'm talking about at the moment. All right, back to the natural law case. Let's see, I don't want to go through all of these. Let's see. If I could see them, it would help. They're pretty tiny. Let's bring this one up. I think homosexual couple getting married will not hurt your marriage. So in the graphic says, raining? Yep. If you don't like gay marriage, then don't get one. I've seen one that says, don't like abortion? Don't have one. That's like saying, don't like murder? Don't commit one. It's absurd. That's not why I'm against this kind of behavior or same-sex marriage. Another example would be, don't like sex trafficking? Then don't have a prostitute or whatever. Now, granted, I have sons, so at least I'm on the lower spectrum of having to worry about sex trafficking and things. I'm glad about that, but that doesn't make me less against sex trafficking because it doesn't affect me as much as someone else. That's just ridiculous. Completely irrational. It's necessarily immoral, and it degrades marriage itself. It degrades what marriage actually is. It also harms those involved. Just like the alcoholic, whether they realize it or not, they're being harmed physically, emotionally, spiritually, socially. The stats back that up on a number of levels. Even if you find individual instances where that may not be the case, and maybe they're living a happy, fulfilled life, at least they think they are, they're still being affected in a number of ways, or will be, because they're not fulfilling what is actually good for them according to their human nature. That's, just pragmatically speaking, has negative effects on children and society, again, based on what we mean by natural law, according to what should be good for children and society. And it affects religious freedom, which is another violation of a natural right that we have to believe as we want to believe, as long as we're not harming someone in the process. All right, so I'll end with this one, and then we'll chase a couple of rabbits. I'll end with this one because I've experienced this personally, and it's not fun. It was a rather difficult time when I was doing college ministry at UNC Greensboro. Not affirming homosexual behavior causes people to kill themselves. And the little graphic says, is against gay marriage because it harms the bringing up of precious children, drives gay kids to suicide by building an anti-homosexual culture. Been called some names I won't repeat in here, and have essentially been told that I was responsible for causing people not necessarily to kill themselves, but to cut themselves and different stuff. So obviously nothing should drive someone to that point. And we should certainly do everything we can to not be the cause of driving someone to that point, you know, as much as it depends on you, live in harmony with one another, kind of thing. Not at the expense of truth, but it means we're not going to bully people, we're not going to insult people, we're not going to scream at people. All of these things we're communicating truth-wise. I hope it's a given that we're doing so in love and out of respect. I don't think I have to emphasize that part in this particular class. Now, most likely these suicidal tendencies or cutting or whatever it may be are caused by secondary emotional issues. This is called comorbidity, where there are multiple factors going on, but they manifest themselves in one particular behavior, one particular tendency or something like that. But there's actually many different things that are going on behind the scenes. Dr. Paul McHugh, he's the psychiatrist and chief at Johns Hopkins, he actually stopped performing sex change operations, I think in the 70s, because he saw that the people that had the operations, maybe they didn't necessarily regret having the operation, but they still had the same emotional issues they had before the operation. And they knew, oh, if I could just do this, that's going to solve all my problems. No, it's not. Maybe you're still happy with your surgery, whatever, but you still have the same problems because that was not your problem. It was just manifesting itself in that particular issue. And this goes back to natural law and those sorts of things. Our identity is not dictated by our desires. I don't know if you guys saw, mine just went blank, the circus movie.
Greatest Showman.
Greatest Showman. Really cool movie.
Yeah.
Soundtrack's incredible. There's a really great song called This Is Me. Now, in the context of the movie, all they're saying is, hey, you got a disability, you're a little different, whatever. Hey, you're still a human being. Man, go live your life. Hey, shout that from the mountaintops. Awesome. If you watch the Oscars, the actress sang the song, did an awesome job, and they had people with disabilities, and they had minorities, and they had this, and they had that, and they had homosexual couples, and gender identity people, and all of these people being included. Which, on the surface, really, I mean, if you stop and think for 30 seconds about this, so you're equating homosexual behavior now with this particular disability. Okay, great, you're getting there. You're getting close to understanding this issue. That's essentially what they were saying without even realizing that that's what they're doing. But they're trying to hijack, and I don't mean that they, like it's us versus them, I'm sorry, it's just an easy way to speak, and I shouldn't do that. But the song and those ideas are being hijacked to say, hey, you be whoever you want to be, and anybody who tells you differently doesn't love you. You follow your heart, and if they don't accept it and affirm it, then they don't love you. And if they don't love you, then they must hate you. Well, gee, if they hate me, then maybe I'll just kill myself. This is crazy. We had some pretty serious issues with one of the liberal Christian group leaders at UNCG. I had lunch with him, sat down, and we were talking through things, and I actually came away thinking, this guy really does love these kids. He just has a really screwed up view of what love is. Because he wants to affirm their desires and their identities because he thinks that's what makes them them. But he's actually the one digging their graves, shovel by shovel by shovel, affirming that idea in their head. Because we are not our desires. And if we are, then by golly, lock me up, because I'm one screwed up person some days. Now imagine we probably most fall into that boat on some extent. It was really sad. I mean, it was humbling, and okay, you're not a monster. You're really trying to love these kids. You just don't know what love is. Because you really don't know what a human being is. Because you have bad ideas that have bad consequences. And that is a rather dangerous thing. So love is willing the good of another. And if I'm intentionally willing someone to be something they're not, then I'm doing the opposite of loving them. I'm willing their annihilation. I'm willing them not to be. That's anything but love. And that's essentially what this guy was doing. Now, I didn't have the guts to, and probably the knowledge to say all that at the time, but nevertheless, that is what is going on. And again, just logically speaking, does the person making this claim want me to die? Because he's not affirming my beliefs and my behaviors. And if that means that therefore I should go kill myself, well then, you must want me to die. Hopefully they wouldn't say that. But logically, that is what they're saying. If to disagree with someone means that leads someone to suicide, then why are you disagreeing with me then? The only option is because you want me to die, if that's how you think the argument actually works. So again, it's just completely irrational. So I'll sum up with this quote from Phaser, and then we'll chase a couple rabbits. If there are no ends set for us by our nature, then there can in principle be no objective, non-arbitrary way of determining what is good for us to do, and thus what we ought to do. Hence, in the final analysis, and in the main, if not in all details, traditional sexual morality and morality full stop stand or fall together. Though liberal advocates of same-sex marriage are fervently moralistic, they have no rational basis whatsoever for their moralism. Now, we've done all of this just looking at what classical natural law means and then applying classical natural law theory to the arguments and the rhetoric. Alrighty? Questions about that? And I'll chase a couple of rabbits.
Why does the inside of your apple have an orange?
Because it's a apple from the Love Equals Love Apple Company.
Gotcha.
If you can read the label. So apples can be oranges, oranges can be apples. It's whatever you want it to be.
It's amazing, it's about the guy with the kids, what those kids are gonna have to wade through. The gump they're gonna have to wade through to get back.
Yeah.
And that's what hurts, that's what you see.
Yep. Yep. And of course, I mean, can the Holy Spirit do some miraculous transformation in someone's life and they just boom are free from all this? And yeah, of course he can. Is that normative? Probably not. Not for most of us. And even, I mean, I've seen Bible-believing, Orthodox Christian people who are married with kids and still struggle with homosexual tendencies, desires. Now, they would not classify themselves as gay or anything like that. They just naturally, for whatever reason, whether it's upbringing or whatever, are drawn towards having that kind of tendency. But they choose not to act on it. Just like all the rest of us who have tendencies to do things we shouldn't do. Now, that doesn't mean that we equally have an ease at which we're able to not act on those. Obviously, some of us have desires and things that we have to fight much harder than someone else. Or struggle with desires of someone else. They don't struggle with that at all. Right? So it's not equal. I'm not saying that it's equal across the board. I'm just saying that in principle, it is possible not to act on every single desire that we have. And if we did, then we'd all be in jail and we would have no society. It would be a sad place to live. And a very dangerous place to live.
But don't you think that's what's happening when the parents say, you can be whatever you want to be?
Oh yeah, we're fueling it in all kinds of different ways. Yeah. I love Disney, but yeah, I mean, it's like chasing the American dream. Now you can chase the Disney dream and just follow your heart and you wish upon a star. And I love going to Disney World. I'm not saying you should go to Disney World, it's fun. But yeah, I mean, we're fueling that mindset in all sorts of different ways. Even, okay, soapbox, sorry if I make somebody mad. Even the whole trophy mentality.
Oh, yeah.
Everybody gets a trophy.
Exactly.
Nobody's a loser. Yeah, you are, kids. Sorry, you're terrible at basketball. You shouldn't play. Okay? If you want to be on a winning team, then you're just not going to play. You're going to sit the bench. That's just how it is. That's reality.
That's right.
It is life. And man, there are all sorts of ways that we're fueling this mentality. Yep.
Do you think, as far as with homosexuality, do you think that we all sin? But when it comes to homosexuality, we know pretty much that it's a sin we're never going to commit for most of us. And that's why it's looked down so hard. I mean, we know it's wrong, and we know sinning is wrong, but why it's looked down so much?
Yeah, there's definitely more of a cultural stigma attached to that in our Western culture than maybe in Greco-Roman times when men, leaders would have their little boy servants, and did they do homosexual acts or not, that sort of thing. So yeah, I mean, it's the whole cultural stigma that we have, which kind of plays into their hands with, well, say you a bunch of homophobes and you're just scared of us. And, yeah, because that's how we act sometimes, and that's wrong.
Right.
And so we have to get over that stigma of just this mentality that as conservatives, most of us have probably grown up with, that, oh, it's so dirty. Yeah, it is dirty and it is wrong and it is all these things. But that doesn't mean I should approach someone with that mentality and act that way towards them. So there's kind of some give and take there of how we have to interact with that.
Yeah, like we talk about it at work. There's something about even effeminate behavior by a man or masculine behavior by a woman, or straight up homosexuality, that it's violating something so much more foundational to who they are than an act. So if you lie, it's a sin, but it doesn't go down to
it's not against nature as a whole of who you are as a human being.
So there are different types of sin, obviously. Every single one of them keeps you away from God and will send you to hell. So we don't say like my sin's not as bad as your sin. It should humble us. But like it's interesting in Romans 1 where it says after they rejected what they should have seen through the created world, they went as far as even to have a homosexual life. So he's saying they went all the way once you reject God. Is general revelation. So I think it's something very foundational. What we talk about at work is your spirit feminine and masculine? And that's kind of a question.
Yeah, there is, even amongst, we consider ourselves Thomists when it comes to philosophy. You probably heard Eric talk about that term. But even amongst those who agree generally philosophically about a lot of the metaphysics and all that, I mean, there's debate even with those specifics of, was it just the body that is gendered, or is the soul actually gendered? And but the body's so composite is the actual human being. So where does all that fall in? And that's when we all fall asleep. That's when the conversation becomes boring and nobody cares to talk to us anymore.
I think with the homosexual, getting back to what we were talking about, it's viewed as one of the words.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of it is because it's so damaging. It's damaging to everything that God created. The family unit. It's all against all of that. And the family is the main thread of our society. So consequently, when you have homosexuality, you're tearing God's plan all apart. And also something you mentioned too about the suicide. In some countries, homosexuality has never been a problem like as it is with us, because there's never been Christian, like for instance, Sweden and Norway, and the homosexuality is completely accepted there and always has been. So there's not been a stigma against it. However, their suicide rate for homosexuality is just as high as anybody else's. So what that says to me is there's some unhappiness there. There's something void there. Because if these homosexuals in these countries, if they're committing suicide at the rate they are in our country, it's not because of the acceptance.
Yeah, and that goes back to the comorbidity thing, that there's other things going on there. It's manifesting itself in this particular behavior. But but I think you bring up a good point, because that's one reason why I would tend to not rely on more pragmatic kinds of arguments, that this is hurting society, or it is doing all those things, but you can always point to counterexamples of but look at this homosexual couple, they're nice and happy and nobody has AIDS and they're living successful lives and they're doing all this, but it's still bad. They're still harming themselves in other ways objectively because of what we've seen, even if pragmatically it doesn't make a difference.
Life expectancy is like 15 to 20 years.
Among males, it definitely.
And the diseases, there are other diseases than
but what we have to be careful with is saying it's bad because it has all these effects. No, it has all these effects because it's bad. And those are two entirely different things. So it's not bad just because it has these effects. Because if we can somehow find cures for the diseases or this, that, and the other, then we can eradicate the effects. And hey, that was good. No, it has these effects because it's bad, objectively. And again, this is just a case study we're using to think through some of the natural law arguments, but obviously it's a very prominent case study that we have to hear about on a daily basis. So let me real quickly just run, and I'll hang out as long as you guys want to hang out, but how does morality depend on God? Because we haven't really talked about that. And we hear a lot about the moral argument and those sorts of things. I think most of the time the moral argument, as it's normally framed, is false. It just doesn't work. But not false. Our arguments aren't false. It's invalid. It just doesn't work because it skips some steps. It tries to jump straight from, we have some objective morality, to God. There's some middle steps there that you have to go through in order for the argument to be valid. So I still think morality is a great argument for the existence of God, just not the way we typically do it. So like natural science, the water cycle, we're hearing it raining right now, photosynthesis, whatever. We can understand a lot about those things without ever appealing to God. You don't have to say, well, plants can photosynthesize sunlight because God, no, they just have these special cells and all this sort of stuff. Now, why does that plant exist at all? God, right? And we got an argument for that. But just like natural science, we can understand a whole lot about morality and ethics, as we've seen, just by looking at reality, thinking well about reality. So we know that natural law or morality is based on our essence as human beings. Now, if you go back to your apologetics, if you're in here for those classes, you'll know that man is a combination of essence, what he is, and existence, that he is. He's not existence itself. We receive our existence. We don't exist on our own. We're a combination of essence and existence, or act and potency, if you've heard those terms, or not. So we must receive our existence, and that chain has to end in something who is existence itself, who is being itself. Pure act is what God is. And that is what we mean by God. So God's intellect, as the cause of our being, is the ultimate source of our essence. So since he determines what our essence is, and good is determined by our essence, then God essentially does determine what is good for us. So it does ultimately all point back to God, but just not in this kind of just real thin divine command theory kind of way. That, well, it's bad because God said it is. It's bad because it's contrary to what is good for me according to my essence, and God is ultimately the source of me existing now with the essence that I have. That's how morality depends on God. So there's some steps there that we often jump over that just makes our understanding of that very thin, and it seems very superficial, especially to unbelievers when we try to, where you think this granddaddy in the sky is going to be up there and bop me on the head when I do wrong. That's kind of what God sounds like when we start talking in those terms. It's much deeper and more fulfilling than that when we start to think about some of these things a little bit more. And then this little chart is from Budichevsky's book, Written on the Heart. So we have God's eternal law, which is how he, again, from his divine intellect, orchestrates the reality that he has created. And then off of that, we have natural law, which we've talked about tonight. We have divine law, which is like Old Testament special laws for Israel for special purposes at special times, those sorts of things. And then human law. And we talked about how human law is a derivative of natural law. So it doesn't violate natural law. It's a specific outworking of natural law. But it also shouldn't violate any kind of divine law when that divine law is properly understood. So we can wear mixed fabrics, we can eat shellfish, we can do all these things because Old Testament law doesn't apply to us. We're not a theocracy. We're not Old Testament Israel being governed by God at this very moment in the Old Testament Israel kind of way. Alrighty? Any other questions? Trying to remember what else I got here. But we're about out of time. Questions, comments? I'll shut up. What are you doing? Taking a picture? Oh, sorry. That's an ugly picture. I'm sorry.
It's okay. You're far in the background.
Okay, good. Let me turn this way. That's better.
I want to say, this is a good segue here. Like Tina and Sheila and Al, you guys I know for sure have been here for many of the classes, especially we just got through doing. I didn't know you were getting into act potency and stuff. That's awesome.
Always. You can't talk about God without act potency.
Because we just got through doing, before we did the cults and world religions, we did a series on God's nature. That's when you joined us, I think, was during that, and you too. So you can see how all this stuff starts to, all the things that we study, it's a whole system called reality. And so when we study reality, you start to realize, wow, politics is affected by act and potency. That's crazy. Why should I? So when Christians say things like, well, why study philosophy? Why study God's attributes from a philosophical perspective? I hope you got to see why. So everyone was probably at different levels. How much of what he said did you understand and sunk in?
You're not going to hurt my feelings.
Don't worry. Yeah, he's fine.
A lot.
A lot. Good. How many of you felt there's a long way to go?
You probably understood more of it than I did, actually.
That's why you have quotes on the screen.
That's right.
That's what he said. I don't know. There's a lot more to know, right? And a lot more to kind of put together. And that's okay. And that's why this group, the FBCIT Apologetics, is a year-long thing. That's why we dabble with the politics and culture right now. We just got through doing cults and world religions, God's nature. We're going to go back in the fall and do apologetics from zero to Christianity. And you start to see how all these elements start to piece together. And just anybody here do martial arts or has done them? Jeet Kune Do, which is, yeah, I know some. This is maybe a bad analogy, but I like it because Bruce Lee's cool. Everyone likes Bruce Lee, right? Bruce Lee studied a number of different martial arts, Taekwondo, Jiu-Jitsu, Karate, all these different ones, and he merged them together. And what he said is you study all of them so that when you're in a confrontation, a fight, you can pull from whatever you need to at that moment to counter whatever's coming at you. It's kind of what studying reality is like. You have to do heavy philosophy. You have to do heavy theology, biblical studies. You have to do things that they do on Tuesday nights during the year, which is, okay, now how do I get out there and do something? Like, there are certain actions that we can do that are, as Christians, that are really counterproductive and stupid if we want to accomplish certain things in our culture. And there are certain actions that we can do that are really strategic and smart. So all of these things matter. That's why a church has apologetics ministries, women's ministries, men's ministries, worship ministries, because it all plays together. So I'm hoping that's what you guys are seeing through this and through the summer series here. So,
and my goal always is, even if you're not the one who does this or interested enough in it, or you don't have to go get a degree and all that, you know that somebody has, and that the thinking is out there, the answers are out there, the substance is out there, and you don't have to settle for just well, you know, the Bible says. Well, I'm glad you know what the Bible says. But understand that there are deeper answers. And even if you don't always know those, you know that they're available. And that enough is satisfying to me.
And quotes are great. Greg Gutfeld says, you have to do all this hard work if you want to convince me. Turn that around. And when you have homosexual activists that try to compare what their struggle is with the civil rights struggle of the 60s, go to the Martin Luther King Jr. quote and say, okay, where's your letter from a Birmingham jail? Because Martin Luther King Jr. said, all right, natural law, which is what we say our country is founded on, tells me and tells you that this is wrong, of what you're doing. This law is immoral because of natural law. Okay, homosexual activists, how is our position violating natural law? Martin Luther King Jr. did the hard work. He thought about it, he wrote about it. You guys have zero in terms of arguing why we should be accepting it. So don't you dare compare what you're doing with what the civil rights movement was about. And we can jump right to it and go to Thomas Aquinas. Like, how many homosexual activists are quoting Aquinas and Augustine and St. Paul? And so you can see they're getting a lot with very little effort. It's all rhetoric and political maneuvering. That we need to be ready with things like this. Like, hey, don't go there. That is not a civil rights issue. And you can say why. And like Adam said, I can't tell you how many times I've been encouraged to, or emboldened to say something or get into an argument or a debate with somebody, not because I had all the answers, but because I knew my professors did or a certain book did, and I could just say, yeah, I don't know, but read Hugh Ross. I don't understand astrophysics, but here's an astrophysicist. So read this and you tell me if the person's into that. So just knowing that someone out there is on the case should embolden us. So thank you. For that, you wanna close us up there?
Sure.
All right, cool.
Oh, Lord, we're grateful for your goodness and your faithfulness and your mercy and your grace towards us, Lord, towards me. Thank you for loving me in spite of myself. God, I pray that you would give us eyes to see with graciousness as you do, to see with love, Lord, but understanding what love actually is and understanding what good actually is. Lord, empower us with your Holy Spirit to shine a light in this dark culture and to do so with gentleness, respect, but with boldness and with courage. Lord, help us not to be discouraged. We see a lot of battles that we seem to be losing and things that just seem to be lost, Lord, but we truly do know that you win in the end. The war is not even a battle. It's done before the beginning of time. And Lord, we trust in that. But you've put us here to play a purpose. And I pray that you would help us to be faithful to that. That you would give us wisdom, discernment, encouragement, diligence to carry on, to stand firm, and to realize that we too are put here for the defense of the gospel. We love you, Lord. Thank you for loving us. In Jesus' name.